Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. You're listening to a show that is all about ideas, about the search for wisdom and knowledge through conversation. My guests all have something to say, and they have the credentials to say it persuasively. Here, the conversation continues. Thank you for joining me for Season 7 of the Optimistic Curmudgeon. And I'm your host, Josh Herring. My guest today is Dr. Mike Young. Dr. Young is a professor at Faulkner University and the Great Books Honors College, also a professor at Abilene Christian University and Johnson University. He is a returning guest. Back in Season 3, we recorded an episode on Gadamer and hermeneutics, so definitely go back and check that episode out. Dr. Young, welcome back to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Look forward to our discussion. One little correction, though. I'm not attached to ACU anymore. So, yeah. So
there we go.
I just don't want to be braggadocious and claiming things that are not real.
That's a great attribute. I was going to try and tie that to actually tomorrow we're posting the last episode of Season 6, and Catherine Bradshaw is she adjuncts for Abilene Christian.
Right.
So I guess y'all don't have that in common then, and we'll leave it at that.
Okay.
Well, I didn't realize this when I emailed you a few months back to see if you wanted to come on the show to talk about Scruton, but we've had something of a Scruton series going. This will be the third episode across 3 seasons, but I've interviewed Dr. Daniel Pitt and Dr. Ferenc Horcher, both on Sir Roger. And today I'm really excited that we get to discuss Sir Roger's book, Beauty, a very short introduction. This should be quite fun.
Yeah. Well, and I will do a little bit of proviso that I am certainly not a specialist or expertise or having expertise in Sir Roger, or in fact, even aesthetics. I am a great admirer of his, as well as a very much a student of aesthetics. I am attracted to and even desirous to know more about beauty in function for and with the church. So that's some of my interests. And if nothing else, hopefully I can share that hunger and desire with your audience today.
I think that's a great place to start. And I too am really a mere dabbler when it comes to aesthetics. I've been thinking about it perhaps more this summer because I'm teaching a class called Beauty and Wonder in Math and Science. And as part of that, I am no mathematician and no scientist. So a lot of our discussions have really kind of focused on where do we see beauty in a particular application of science or an artifact of study. Today, my class was kind of all about the ideas of proportion and ratio and looking at the different kinds of mathematical harmony that we tend to associate with beauty. So I suspect, and Sir Roger seems to fit in that too somehow as I know he was a formerly credentialed philosopher, but he's so widely read that I read him and he seems to be more of a generalist, though he's saying things in a very, very articulate, very nuanced way.
Yeah. Let me throw in, you're mentioning mathematics, this book by Gerald McDermott, Everyday Glory, in which he first really talks about typology in the Bible, in which finding types of Christ to be found in the Old Testament and then also in the New Testament. But he does then a series of chapters, one of them being on science, including mathematics. And what he references there, that it has become almost a criteria for the accuracy or truth of a scientific theory is to its degree of beauty. And particularly what's being referred to there is that symmetry. And there's even discussion of a supra-symmetry that also involves mathematics, that there's this incredible, beautiful, harmonious symmetry to be discovered even at subatomic particles to the cosmic level. And then mathematics is almost a language within itself that seems seemingly embedded within the created order.
Well, let me ask you to expand on that just a little bit, because one of the books that I've just started reading for this class is it's by a guy named Ian Stewart. It's called Beauty for Truth's Sake, A History of Symmetry. And he makes something of a similar argument, I believe, where could you, what are the connections between beauty and truth?
The classic from antiquity on of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and what is the relationship between the three. And I think most, there's a desire to want to make them equal, and in some regard, that is indeed the case. But beauty is unique in that it is physically manifested, it's sensuous, over against perhaps the more conceptual emphasis of truth and goodness, though they too can be certainly manifested in objects within the world and so forth. But beauty, if nothing else, one can say it is a transcendental. It is that which reaches out beyond just the physical realm, material realm. And again, the concept of beauty and true as well. It incorporates it, but is beyond it. And just might mention that, when you bump into something like a transcendental, like beauty, and its relationship to good, that one has to look at not a essence or essential definition, but rather a definition by way of characteristics or elements that are manifested. And for beauty, then, the ones that have been cited through the centuries, one would be symmetry, balance, proportion, order, convention, also incorporating that which has come before. So those are kind of the key elements within beauty. And all of those blend over into or have relationship with that which is good. Balance, proportion, order, those are good things, good characteristics.
So in what way, so I'm trying to think of how that would actually then function as a criterion for the truthfulness of a theory or an idea. Mm-hmm. Does that mean that an equation, I know in chemistry, it's necessary that an equation be balanced, but I don't remember my high school chemistry teacher talking necessarily about the beauty of a balanced equation. She just told us that for it to be correct, it must balance. And that was more a question of function than it was of the beauty of the equation.
Right. Well, I think it has been simply recognized within the last century that great mathematical equations, there's the quality of simplicity and yet comprehensiveness in it that entails great complexity. And so therefore, there's a kind of beauty of the theory or an equation that has this capacity to bring the simplicity, complexity together in such a manner that it is recognizable, or it calls out from us to say, that is beautiful, that it is actually that complex and yet simple and comprehensive. I remember an experience, this is way back in the day when I was an undergrad at Colorado State University, and I, at that time, of all things, was a major in wildlife biology. And I had to take a course in calculus. And I remember the professor starting an equation, had two chalkboards. This is back in the day of chalkboards and dusty chalk. He filled those two boards up on the side, went to the back of the room, filled up the two chalkboards over there. And of course, we're all craning our necks around trying to write stuff down. Went to the side wall with two more chalkboards, filled it up, came back to the front, erased the chalkboards, and then completed the equation. And we're just, absolutely bewildered and overwhelmed. But he's trying to provide all the details. But, to him, it was beautiful because it works, it functions, it manifests truth, manifests reality. But I don't recommend calculus necessarily for your venture into beauty. So.
Well, all of our students here at Thales College have to take calculus as part of their core. So I might, somewhat regularly, I have conversations with very humanities-oriented students. They want to know, why do I have to take calculus? I might add, so that you are better at perceiving beauty, as my stock answer to that question. Then, well, we've already launched straight into using terminology. I want to see if we can back up just a little bit. Dr. Young, help us know just a little bit about aesthetics before we jump into Scruton proper. What is it as a discipline? How old is aesthetics? Who are some of the main voices in aesthetics that we should know about?
Right. Well, the term aesthetics itself, there's various stabs at what's the origin of the creation or usage of that term. Some would attribute it in 1711 to Shaftesbury, but generally it's 18th century terminology that it came forth. And it is looking at objects, making judgments, having an attitude, involving an experience and a value. And so those are just, again, some of those characteristics or elements under the umbrella of the term aesthetics. But the idea of a study or reflection on beauty in general, of its age or how far back does that reach? Well, we would go back to the ancients. Certainly Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. We have Plato's Symposium and Lady Wisdom and Beauty and so forth. So it's a subject that has always captivated humankind. And let me throw this in. You may remember it from my class, that one of the things I put up front to try to stomp out and remove from discussion is that beauty is simply in the eyes of the beholder, a popular faddish kind of quip. My rejoinder to that is, no, beauty is that which all people everywhere through all of time have recognized. Yes, indeed, there are particular individual tastes or preferences, but I think there are more commonalities or almost universals of being acknowledged, acknowledging something as beautiful than there are the particulars in some ways. And Scruton provides a wonderful example with regards to tourism and architecture. He said, well, does anyone go to Detroit as a tourist to see the architecture? He said, no. Are there even tourists that ever go there? Kind of snide. But he says, Vienna is overrun all through the year, with tourists to see the beauty of the city and the way it's laid out. And its organization, it's deferring one building to the next, but unity as well. So there are things we recognize. Otherwise, Viking cruise lines wouldn't survive, right? There are things that are beautiful that people want to see around the world.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And it reminds, this past September, my wife and I had the opportunity to go to Paris for 5 days. And we got a great little Airbnb flat on the Ile de Saint Louis, and we were there probably a quarter of a mile away from Notre Dame. Oh. And it was just beautiful. The setting, the place. Now, of course, there's all kinds of other reasons why it's almost impossible to actually live there regularly. Yeah. But it was an absolutely beautiful place to be, and it was not hard to recognize that beauty.
Were you able to get in yet, or was it still closed off to visiting?
No, it was still scaffolded. I don't know. This was September. I know I've seen commercials, at least for the Summer Olympics. They were everything in the city. Yeah, they had a lot of things in Paris that were like the deadline was, we need to get this fixed before the Summer Olympics. So right. I don't know if they made it with the cathedral. Yeah. But I think that's a really helpful definition of beauty, that which all men everywhere have recognized, and that and there's something very experiential in that recognition. Yes. Then this is not just an analytical objective. I can apply my rubric to your piece of art and tell you if it's beautiful. There is something here about the common experience of recognizing that beauty. Is that fair?
Yes, and it challenges you, or it evokes from an individual to recognize it, to acknowledge it beyond, and it's not without reasoning being applied, but it's something maybe more primal, or it is more initially in the response. Is simply, it demands, not in a rude way or a lording it over you way, but it demands of you recognition by its very nature as to what it is. And we, I think, as made in the image of God, are so constructed, if you will, or we are so constituted as to be able to, as a blessing, to recognize it, to acknowledge it, because ultimately the source of all the beauty that we do see or encounter peels out from, if you will, from God himself.
When we were going through the Louvre back in Paris, I was looking, we hit a gallery that was filled with mostly impressionistic paintings. And I usually don't love impressionists. But it occurred to me, like, okay, this is an opportunity. I should try and see an actual Monet.
Yeah.
So I've always heard that Monet is something special. And it took 20 minutes, but I did find a Monet. And it was not one I had ever seen a print or a photograph of before. It was some kind of snowy house meadow scene that was done in his style. And I don't think it was particularly one of his famous ones, but there was some, not visceral in like a painful way, but there was something about that painting that kind of leapt out and grabbed my attention. It was like, you got to pay attention to this. This painting is different. And that response is one I at least I think is some response of beauty, but there was something there about the painting that just pulled me in and wouldn't really let my attention go for a time.
Yeah. And I think that's a key word too, to attend. Even in the realm of spiritual direction or spiritual formation, it is a reading of scripture, a listening to God, attending to it. That is making oneself open to receive. And so art, beauty, has the power to evoke, to wake up in us the desire to attend, to take notice, to look, to absorb, to contemplate, and to look into it more deeply or more thoroughly. And again, I think that's the nature of beauty itself, that it has that positive force. It causes us to attend to it.
I think that those habits of paying attention, I think they once were far more common than they are now. My sense is that today we are an infinitely distracted people, and that there is great beauty around us. But in order to perceive that beauty, we actually have to stop and look and focus on something. I started adding a weekly exercise to my class where I'll prepare some piece of music or find a painting or a poem, and I'll ask my students to just take 10 minutes. Don't check your email. Don't flip your laptop open. Don't even make notes on some other piece of paper. You just need to stare at this image, and you need to pay as close attention as possible, and then we'll discuss it after 10 minutes. And I found the first couple times I did that, I found it very difficult to do that. Like I kept twitching for something else. But the more I did that, the more I would see more in the object that we were studying. Right.
Well, Scruton talks about that we tend to be surrounded by the ugly, or the ugly, how does he say, uglification of the culture. And it is very utilitarian or entrepreneurial marketing, to get your attention, but for the purposes of pointing you away from it to the purchase of or something, or to evoke some kind of emotional response. And I might mention too, another spiritual discipline, attending, but also the idea of silence. And that is a rare commodity in our world, not only exteriorly. It is very difficult of a discipline to manage within ourselves, to create a silence in order to be able to receive. Because if you notice, you sit down, you be still, and you try to be quiet, you might find the environment quiet and silent, but in your head, it's like popcorn, ideas shooting left and right. And it's a very intentional discipline to slow that down and try to make space to receive.
Well, with all of that as kind of prolegomena, let's turn to Roger Scruton. Now, I know Scruton particularly in part because of this book, Beauty. I know he's written about so many other things, but his work on architecture seems to me to have a great focus on beauty. His book he has a tome of like 400 pages called Sexual Desire that is also focused on beauty. And then he has this book, Beauty, a very short introduction. Talk to us a bit about Scruton and beauty. How did Scruton define beauty? Would he agree with the definition that you've offered? Where does he fit into this general conversation about the nature of beauty?
Yeah. Well, this little book, he said he tried to make it as short as possible. And he said, but it still ended up being 120 pages. but he wanted to write it, I think, to get the contours, the elements that are critical in discussing beauty to the general audience. And his definition, I think my copy is a different issue than yours, I believe, with page numbers. On mine, I think it's 142. He does point to the classic elements that we define by way of characteristics rather than essence of the symmetry, proportion, balance, etc. Closure is another term employed sometimes. That it is something that is for and in and of itself. It's not utilitarian. It doesn't point you to something else. It is. It's simply, if you will, bees. And now he will cite, yes, there are occasions when something beautiful can have a pragmatic or utilitarian application. I think he mentions a beautifully formed plane, an airplane. And I can think of some automobiles that are beautifully formed. Not current ones, but some of those in the past. My favorite, a little side note, my favorite would be the Cobra GT, the racing car. Beautiful symmetry and curve and all that, but that's another story.
For all of your former students out there, they now know what kind of car to get you when they make their millions of dollars as humanities teachers.
Carl Truman, he made a special place in my heart too, because he said that was his favorite sports car, the Shelby Cobra.
Well, let me, as a follow-up to that, does that mean that art as activism is inherently either ugly or at the very least far less beautiful? Because my understanding is that this rises so much with modern art. I mean, the art as activism idea is always pointing beyond itself to some cause. So if it's essential to art or to beauty, an artifact of beauty, that it is just itself and not pointing beyond itself, what does that mean for art as activism?
Yeah, and it's usually a social issue or a political issue. And it is absent typically of beauty. It might well be a craft, something crafted. It might be clever, but it's certainly not that which is beautiful. It points away from itself to whatever the cause might be. And so it undermines the very key element of what beauty is, or how beauty shows itself to us, as simply that which exists in and for itself as being beautiful. And I think I may have mentioned this in the class you had with me, and this is maybe 8 years ago. I attended a little seminar here in Dallas, and they had the arts professor at SMU, the director of the Dallas Museum of Art, who has hence left and gone elsewhere. But he said in his world travels, talking to artists, seeking artwork to bring to the museum here in Dallas, he said over the last 30 years, he has never once heard the word, the term, the concept of the beautiful from the artist and connected with their work. Now that seems to me astounding. And it seems to me it is driven by a couple of elements. One, just as you say, because art has turned towards social activism, political activism, or that there is a sense in which the beautiful is passé, been there, done that kind of thing with artwork. And so we leave it behind to be new and avant-garde. But actually, Scruton, in one of his YouTube lectures, calls that fake. It is a creation of something that tries to convince you that it is the actual thing, but it is a fake, in that it is not really art, is not really beautiful, but it tries to promote itself as such. And so you have to create a narrative around it to try to convince people. I think modern art, much of it, has turned away from the very task of what art was supposed to be doing, and that's creating that which is beautiful and calls attention to itself. And instead, it's such things as Brillo pads or the crucifix in a jar of urine, to take away from itself to some social political commentary.
And of course, now I don't want to stay on this too long. This is really just a tangent, but of course now we've reached a day where the activists are now destroying art, and that gets to a whole nother interaction where at the point where art betrays its connection to beauty, it's hard to articulate why exactly it is sacrosanct and why exactly it is so valuable, as crass as it is to try and measure art in monetary terms. But since we do that at auction, I figured I'd at least bring that up.
Yeah.
Well, let me turn to a different question then, because I hope I can ask this without violating your stipulation that beauty is not in the eye of the beholder. But I have a similar rant that I sometimes give to my students, where I tell them, if it's true that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, telling my wife that she is beautiful is a meaningless statement, because that has to be a true statement for it to be of value to her. But it seems so far from what you said that there is. We've laid out that there is a subjective experiential element to beauty. So I want to read a line from Scruton that, at least in my edition, is on page 26. And I'm curious about what you could tease out for us about the relationship between objectivity and subjectivity in the experience of beauty. I put in the question here, this might be some kind of Scruton's phenomenological analysis, but I don't know if that's really the correct term here. Here's the line from page 26. Scruton says, "My pleasure in beauty is therefore like a gift offered to the object, which is in turn a gift offered to me." That line seems to describe an interaction that's somehow happening between Scruton's reaction to the gift and the gift's interaction with him. So what are your thoughts on the subjectivity and objectivity of the experience of beauty?
Right. Well, not meaning to get too deep in the weeds with the whole realm of epistemology, but we have allowed in the modern era, 16th, 17th century on, to allow for and in discussion create this absolute dichotomy or binary between subjectivity and objectivity. I think it is rather the case that especially with regards to encountering beauty, that there is subjectivity, objectivity involved in a dialectic, or if you will, an overlap. But maybe primarily it is simply subject-object in relationship with one another, and that both are required. You, the observer, and then the observed. And I might throw in the book by Esther Meek on Loving to Know, Covenantal Epistemology. And she does a wonderful job of taking and expanding Michael Polanyi in personal knowledge, in which she depicts a triad of covenantal relationship of the knower, the known, knowing before God. And so there's this triadic relationship involved. So yes, there's subjectivity in art. Yes, there's objectivity in art. And they're not standing over in odds with one another in tension, but rather in relation, as almost a conversation, a movement, a dialectic back and forth. But it's in a wholeness. It's not a separable. It's a kind of, if you will, another term might be employed, of interpenetration. They're involved with each other.
Well, that's we'll just follow that. We'll just follow that term then, because one of my favorite parts about Scruton's book. Well, hang on. Before I go there, I want to just say I really do love that idea of them being subjectivity and objectivity in relation to each other. Because so often I think we consider those as somehow mutually exclusive, and yet we do have the experience of seeing something and finding it beautiful, or standing next to a friend and the friend perceives beauty that perhaps I do not. And it's entirely possible that my taste is less developed than my friend's taste. And that maybe my friend is more sensitive to this dialectic relationship than I am. And that's fine. That doesn't mean that one of us is right and one of us is wrong. It means there's a greater or lesser sensitivity to that relationship that's in play. But since you brought up that lovely word interpenetration there to describe this, One of the fun parts about Scruton, I mean, that I was not expecting when I read this book for your class, is that Scruton is thoroughly attuned to the prevalence of the nude in art, and he thinks there is a strong consideration of eros in terms of beauty, and that he actually does put beauty and eros together. But he does that in such a way that I found one of his most fascinating concepts being the way that the distance created through artistic depiction versus the immediacy of the photograph was one of the parts he used to distinguish beauty from erotic beauty from pornography. Here's how he puts it. This is on page 138 in my edition. Scruton writes that beauty comes from human life, sex included, at the distance from which it can be viewed without disgust or prurience. When distance is lost and imagination swallowed up in fantasy, then beauty may remain, but it is a spoiled beauty, one that has been prized free from the individuality of the person who possesses it. It has lost its value and has gained a price. So what's Scruton doing here with kind of this comparison with the erotic, with like what's happening in everything that he's kind of talking about there?
Yeah, I think ultimately beauty has a kind of erotic, even apart from a nude, an erotic power insofar as that it's consuming. It consumes us in the beholding of it, if you will, titillating, because it's so wondrous or moves one towards the sublime, a term we've not mentioned yet, but transcendently beyond us. But one of the key things he points out that the erotic is presented in such a manner that you still are concerning or dealing with the individual being presented or individuals and thinking, reflecting, contemplating about what is presented, as opposed to if it peels over into the realm of pornographic, it is a depersoning of the individual from the body. And so you have strictly an object that you fantasize about and consume, as opposed to wondering about the individual, the person. There's not so much the look towards the face, but the shape and the contours of the body itself, as if it is something to consume like a meal. It is strictly separating out personage from body. And again, one of those disastrous dualisms that get too easily formed in our society.
Yeah, I remember the research paper I wrote for your class. I kind of started trying to study that question about how does the meaning of the nude change across time. And I don't know that anybody who's watching or listening to this conversation would care about this, but I'll put the link to the published version of that paper in the show notes, because Scott Postma's journal, the Consortium, published that one, which I thought was really hilarious, that a journal of classical Christian education was willing to publish a research paper on the meaning of the artistic nude.
Yeah, a brave editorial move. Yeah,
that's right. Dr. Woods weighed in, and he helped with that decision. But be that as it may, part of it, and Scruton gets into this to some degree. He traces a few paintings where this move is happening. There's I'm blanking on the scholar's name, but there was an art historian in the 1950s Britain, who wrote still to this day, the only real history of the artistic nude. And what both he and Scruton agree on is that in the 16th and 17th century, you have plenty of nudes that are just full body celebrations of the integration of the person and the body. I'm blanking on the guy. He's the guy with the really fleshy fat ladies in his nudes. Yeah. See, I say that, and you know who it is, but I can't remember his name. This is really bad. I should have written this down.
Well, just looking at his paintings that he has, he has a Botticelli and a Rembrandt, and then
Rubens. It was Rubens.
Yes, of course.
Yes, Rubens. He had that great line about, he just had this line about the happiness that he was trying to symbolize in the fat rolls.
Yeah.
Which that too, I just thought was hilarious. But in contrast, I think it was Boucher, artist who really, he's the one that Scruton points to. This is kind of the turn, because you have the model is kind of, she's facing away from the viewer, and it's much more emphasizing the body than it is her face and her personality. Her personality is less material in that painting, and that's where you really get this shift to pornographic representation. And that was the mid 19th century, if I remember correctly. But it's I found it so fascinating to look at kind of what was being communicated in that. It's not just a matter of like, oh, let me show off my artistic skills. Like there were a lot of ideas being communicated in that particular art form.
Yeah, he mentions of that particular painting, the blonde odalisque, that she's in a physical position that she would never, nobody would ever be in, except in the context of sexual intercourse, probably. She's lying on her stomach, arched up, and legs apart, etc. So it's obviously a seductive, intentionally seductive pose, and it one loses, by the very contours and shape of her position, loses the person. They get lost in that to evoking of sexual fantasy or desire or whatever, and just the bodiliness of it all. And it may be a fine distinction, but I think it is one that can indeed be accomplished, I think, as has been done in the history, as you point out, of the painting of the nude.
Well, I mean, certainly if you go back to Botticelli's Venus rising from the sea, then Aphrodite is looking straight at you. There's no, and there's sort of an attempt to recover the body without shame in that. And of course, there you've got, you have the Greek idea of that. This is what I found so fascinating. The Greeks were not, this is all over any Greek sculpture. I mean, every Greek sculpture is following the same pattern. There are no, these men do not exist anywhere who have these particular torsos or abs or like 18-inch heads. Like those just don't exist. Your Greek sculptors are attempting to portray an ideal, and they're doing that in a certain way. But as we get into the modern era, we move from an idealization to a representation to a depersonalization. And that's, I don't mean to draw a straight line narrative there, but those three phases do occur, not causally. But it's as we're looking in the question of beauty, I think it, particularly with beauty and human persons who are portrayed, it really is part of the task of the artist, I think, to preserve the personhood of the individual being portrayed. And not rip that away for some perceived benefit. Right.
A couple items I'll mention, not only of the ancient Greeks, but Michelangelo's David, incredibly beautiful statue, beautiful body, but his hands are inordinately large. And it was intentional on his part to exude strength. He's a young man in the statue, right? A youth, but he's very well muscled and contoured. But then he has these overly large hands to cast the stone. And I was going to say too that I may have lost my thought, but the movement of degradation of the person, the individual, and so forth, it's almost a self-destructive pattern of attacking the culture, attacking that which is considered valuable, the things that are beautiful, and so forth. So we want to just raise the whole scene and build anew, but there's really not much of an offer of what that new would be. And I would point this out too with regards to a current practice of color. My wife's an architect, and she helps sensitize me to some things in architecture and also colors. But in architecture right now, black, white, and gray, colorless. And, so what is it? A apocalyptic charred earth we're shooting for? And notice car colors, white, gray, black, with an occasional red for blood.
I'm gonna think about that when I get in my cherry red Camry this afternoon drive home. I'll be like,
Well,
I'll
at least
drive
you're breaking up the gray and white a little bit.
That's right. Well, it's funny you bring that up. As you were just, even before you said that, I was thinking, okay, these two things in Sir Roger's mind, I think they must have gone together, because he writes just about as much about bad architecture as he does about bad art. And I think he sees those as twin problems in the modern era, that we've lost sight of the relationship between beauty and form and community in cities. And we've lost sight of the relationship between beauty and form and human life that is oriented towards the good, the true, and the beautiful.
Right. Well, a couple architectural in-house phrasings or comments that they typically will make. One is that, of course, form or function over form. And part of the drive in that is simply what clients want. Money is involved. And so the phrase that my wife often refers to is shade and shadow cost money. So in other words, on the exterior of a building, if you do anything to help give it texture and design and a beautification, or at least ornamentation, that all costs money and the client doesn't want it. So we get these flat-faced glass boxes. And another one is, and I think this is probably particularly true with clients she's encountered, is some people have taste only in their mouths.
Oh, that's phenomenal. I really love that line. Let's follow that thread then, because I have two follow-ups I want to get to, but let's go with taste first. How exactly do you form taste, or to what degree is taste part of the task of education? Are we trying to help every time I bring this up in the classroom, I invariably have at least one student who asserts, "Oh, Mr. Herring, taste is just you, because you're an adult. You're saying what you like is better." And it's back to the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So I guess I'm at two parts of the question. Like, is taste real? And B, how do we help other people have better taste?
Well, one, I think maybe starting off with, is there such a thing as good, better, best? Does that exist? If you can get people to acknowledge that, then perhaps there might be the possibility that a person could point to something and say, look at this, and then provide information, background, knowledge, whatever. So there is an educational process going on, say, and I'm certainly no musician, but looking at the intricacy of the movement of notes within a given piece of classical music, and showing the design and so forth, something they may not recognize otherwise. There's an educational process going on. And then, of course, to listen to it, to hear those variances and those details, and that it can provide perhaps an experience by which it helps develop their taste. And that's what Scruton's point is. There is a rationality to taste, as Kant would argue as well. There is an education that can be involved. But ultimately, what that education can do is to lead one up to that which it can't do, and that is to provide their individual phenomenological experience, if you will. It has to be their experience for them to recognize, acknowledge, or to see it as beautiful, and to develop that taste. So I use this illustration. It's something akin to Philip in the Gospel of John. And he goes to Nathanael. We found the Messiah. And he says, he's from Galilee. He's like, yeah, there's nothing good from there. And it says, well, come and see. And so the educational aspect of developing taste is a kind of coming and see, which implies you individually, you have to experience or whatever the artwork, and that maybe it will nurture the development of that taste to be more specific or more exacting of distinguishing between good, better, and best.
No, I think that's really helpful. Well, are we getting garbled? Maybe a little bit.
I'm fine. Yeah.
Okay, good. Something was happening on my end then. We'll clean that up before we publish this episode. Is that why you had us watch all of Wagner?
You're not going to pin that on me. Put that on Dr. Robertson. He's the one. Of course, Scruton wrote, quite a bit on Wagner. So,
He did. I'm just thinking that the pattern of that class fits the model you're describing, because that class had a substantial amount of requiring us to experience things that those who had taste in opera and in painting and the literary criticism of art had chosen for us and wanted us to experience. And we gained those bits of knowledge along the way. But really, still to this day, the most formative parts of that class were deciding I had accomplished something meaningful, or maybe not, but at least I was done with opera und drama. But then having really felt like, okay, I do see why people love opera. I don't love opera, but I at least see why others do. That was, and it really was the experiential part of that. It wasn't just listening to you and Dr. Robertson talk about Wagner. It was having to listen to Wagner himself.
Yeah.
Well, let me go to a different thread I want to follow up on. You mentioned the term the sublime earlier, and that's one I really want to circle back to, in part because it also comes into one of my favorite books to teach, C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, and he drops the term the sublime, and he says the story that everyone knows from Wordsworth and the Waterfall. And I have yet to meet anyone on the planet who just already knows that story prior to reading Lewis. And certainly we all know this. So I don't know that we think about sublimity enough in the contemporary world, unless we happen to be taking an aesthetics course. Scruton has this line on my page 63 where he kind of compares beauty and sublimity. Here's how he puts it. The beautiful landscape prompts us to a judgment of taste. The sublime vista invites another kind of judgment, in which we measure ourselves against the awesome infinity of the world and become conscious of our finitude and frailty. So, Dr. Young, what is the difference between beauty and the sublime?
Yeah, certainly overlap. The sublime typically would be beautiful, but it's something more. And as Scruton points to, it is that which causes one to recognize or to be measured by it and to say, I'm this big against this great big thing, and it is, I want to use the word staggering insofar as it moves the mind, the heart, the core of your being to realize the magnitude of reality beyond yourself and your little place in it. So I think the sublime is beautiful, but more than it's a transcendent, suprasensorial experience that causes one to almost get lost in the vastness of reality, a recognition of that. And again, I'll point to McDermott's book there. And I'm certainly no mathematician or cosmologist, but he points to, and I don't have all the numbers in my head, but he points to an interesting example of how light from the nearest sun takes 4 years to get here. And so, or a star. So what he's saying is it brings the past into the present, and you experience a 4-year-old bit of light in the present. And then he starts talking about the number of years involved in the outer reaches of what we can see. And it is utterly staggering to even try to conceive of how vast the created order is and recognize our finitude within that. And our finitude seems to be smaller than a nuon or muon in a subatomic particle, that kind of thing. And yet, and this is what he's pointing to as one of those type antitypes, is that the created order is such that it is for the purpose to teach us of the sublime, the grandness of God himself. This being that designed and created all of this loves us in the midst of all this. And that's phenomenal.
As you're describing that, you reminded me, I just finished reading Anthony Esselin's new translation of Augustine's Confessions. And I literally just this morning, I sent off my review to the Acton Institute of that. And it was part of what I've read excerpts of the Confessions before, but as I read this, I don't think I've ever read the whole one before. And part of what Tony did, and I think it's an incredible achievement in translation, but part of what he did with this was really convey a sense of just how in awe of God Augustine was.
Yeah.
And there's sections where he talks about the majesty of God, the reality of God existing outside of time, and what that means for what does it mean for God to be the eternal present, where all days are God's day, so that it can be true that God the Father says to God the Son, "Today I have begotten you." The only way that can be true in the logic of the Trinity is for God to exist in the eternal present. So all of our present is flowing from the divine nature, and we experience it as it becomes the past, and it is coming to us as the future.
Right.
And it just, as he was describing it, I was trying to mentally imagine this, and it was vaster and more convoluted and complex than I could really hold in my head.
Yeah.
And I suppose that is some sense of the sublime. Is that a fair analogy?
Moves us beyond ourselves to a recognition of the grandiosity, if you will, of reality, of the created order, etc. And with regards to time, it's like God is in the eternal present that encapsulate past, present, and future at once as the eternal present. And it as you say, it tends to bend the mind to incomprehension and yet acknowledgement.
Yes, I was gonna say yes to that. The incomprehension yet acknowledgement. So, in that sense, I wonder if there's something too about as we move into the 20th century and into the 21st century, our focus becomes so myopic culturally. We get poetry, novels, films are all about the individual. And with the postmodern fragmentation of philosophy moves even the focus of epistemology to the individual self as the judge of what is true. Does our focus on that singular vision, does that make it more difficult for us to rise to this kind of sublime vision of the whole?
Well, I think it's time to once again put forth and to hear Dostoevsky and the Idiot when Prince Mishkin says, "Beauty will save the world," and to and I think in many regards there's pockets within the given present culture that there is an openness for and yearning for beauty, and so I think the church, Christianity, needs to be producing beautiful things as well as beautiful people, of course, virtuous people. So I think it's almost an evangelistic call. It is a missionary call for us to put forth the beautiful, teach that which is beautiful, and to be seekers of it, even in this realm, because it is a shadow that points to the reality of the beauty of God. And I used this illustration recently of, you had the sun providing light. Here's a wooden box and a shadow cast by it. And by the way, it's one way that they use to detect adjusted or manipulated pictures to see if the shadows are accurate to the object involved. And my point is that the shadow is integrally part of the box. The box produces the shadow. The shadow is not just some symbol. No, it is connected to the box because it is part of that reality. And so all the things that are beautiful in this world point to, not this is ugly illustration, but the box, but God himself, that all of creation is a type pointing to, and that we've been so constituted to be able to recognize it if we'll open our eyes.
Well, just on the off chance that one of two groups are listening now or hear the recording at some point of this episode, if Dr. Young, if you are correct, then we really need two groups of people to be on board with what you are describing for this to really affect the church. The first group, I would say, I'm just going to throw my tribe under the bus. We Southern Baptists within the Protestant world are the worst for church architecture. We are all about just taking other people's buildings and repurposing them And when we do build buildings today, we build the most functional, ugly buildings imaginable.
Yes.
So the first step, I think, is really getting churches on board to say, actually, having beautiful spaces does matter. But then the second group that then would be necessary for doing that are millionaires and possibly billionaires. Because my dad's on staff at a large Southern Baptist church, and I'll just tell you, I mean, like when they have to make building decisions, like there is a finite budget. But so if there are very wealthy donors who are listening to this, you think, okay, yes, I believe in beauty. Just then dedicate your dollars accordingly, because if a church is given a $10 million gift with no strings attached, a decent amount of that might be used in a renovation of the pastor's office, or it could go to create a beautiful structure that would elevate the heart and the mind to perceive the glory of God.
Yeah. Well, even more financially accessible, we need to be producing artists. What's his name that wrote the book Life in the Negative World? Ren.
Oh, Aaron Ren. Yes.
Aaron. Yeah. And he mentions, one of the things we need to do is to be creating beautiful things, to have artists. An example of currently we do have is Makoto Fujimura, the Japanese artist, but he's a rare bird.
Yep.
And then we have Jeremy Bigby, the classical pianist and composer, but also theologian. So we have a few rare instances within, quote, the morass of what's called the evangelical world. But basically, we're not producing it. It's not a value in discussion among us, and that's a loss. And one way to reach the world is to be producing beautiful things.
One other name I might throw in there, I think I've got this name right. Do you know Arthur Kwan Lee?
I've heard the name, but I'm not familiar with him.
I have not seen his paintings anywhere except the internet and thus my TV or my computer screen. But he does biblically themed paintings. He lives in New York. He's a currently working artist. His internet personality, at least, would have some. I would have questions if I was his small group leader. some of the ways he presents himself, but his art is absolutely breathtakingly gripping. I know. Dr. Jewell did a Substack post on his lifelong learner about Arthur Kwan Lee's masculinity series. He did these very viscerally manly images of heroes of the Old Testament, like his Moses and Samson were just very beautifully done. And so he's another one, but I think you're absolutely right. And then that's a quick side note. We should start wrapping this up. Well, two quick side notes. We actually have a somewhat decent live stream audience. So if any of the 8 people that my screen tells me are watching have any interest in posing a question, feel free to put a comment in, and we may take those here in just a moment. Nope, it's possible nobody does, but Dr. Young, I want to actually close with a question that came in earlier from Miguel Benitez in the Faulkner program.
Right.
I don't know if he's actually listening. He may not have been able to with his work schedule today. So I'm going to ask this question for him. And I'll tell him I shouted him out on the show a couple times too.
Okay.
But he wanted to know why exactly is Scruton so popular with conservative folks, given that he's not really a Platonist. He's more of a Kantian, and he's looking for more of a rational explanation of beauty rather than some of the more like the beautiful as a transcendent form. So do you have any thoughts on why exactly Scruton resonates as an aesthetics guy for the typical conservative today?
My guess is, one, that there are not many voices that have been heard in a more popular level that express a conservative stance in general regarding aesthetics. And he does, I remember watching one of his video clips, YouTube clips, that, he talks about the beauty of the liturgy and how it's been messed up of late, and that, and the idea of the repetition of it, because it's in and of itself, its content, its form, structure is to be repeated, and so forth. So he certainly has an openness towards referencing to Christianity. So I think in general, he may not be exactly aligned with, say, many conservatives with regards to hearkening back to Plato and Aristotle and so forth. But he nevertheless does track down similar path insofar as he's counting things that are beautiful as beautiful, things that are called art in the current scene as ugly. He denounces it and gives rationale why. And I think that in of itself, at least, provides some turf upon which we can connect. And I think it is truly, we lost him, in January 2020, I believe he passed away.
Mm.
It is a real loss because he did have an audience and he was noted and provided a voice that was steering towards the good, the true, and the beautiful, whether his path of getting there was quite the same as we might want to choose. Regardless, it's still very similar.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you for that. No other questions seem to have come in, so I'll ask my last question. And I just want to close today with kind of a recommendations question. Dr. Young, just in case we've got anybody who's heard this and thought, man, I wish I could experience some of what he's talking about. Where would you recommend people get started with kind of seeking out experiences of beauty? Any particular pieces of music, pieces of art, something else to say, this is a great place to start?
Well, the most immediate is nature itself. I wrote a little article on beauty and sense of wonder for the Convivium, that our consortium, that article, our journal for the classical Christian schools. And in that, I tried to hammer out a definition a little bit towards what beauty is. And I ended up the article with my own personal walk through the woods and seeing, just grabbed my attention, something on the ground amidst the fallen leaves, fall leaves, that looked, initially, I thought it was a piece of jewelry, like a brooch or something. And I looked closer and picked it up. It was a moth, a tiger wood something moth. And it's yellow background with black lines. It is absolutely gorgeous. And it was dead, but perfectly intact, sitting on this one leaf. And it just, what I noted in myself was that sense of awe because of its vividness and strength of power to capture my attention. And so my closing comment in the article was, go, if you want to discover or recover wonder, go take a walk in the woods and look. So certainly, I think nature provides ample examples. But I will also point, I got a couple books here, and you may be familiar. This is a wonderful, get the lighting right. This is a wonderful coffee table book, if you will, by Mary Elizabeth Podles. She wrote articles in Touchstone. I think she still does. But she takes pieces of artwork, religious artwork, and in 1,000 words gives commentary or describes and discusses them. And in her pithy descriptions, it is part of that development of taste. She is giving you information, insights that make you want to say, wow, it captures you. And the other text I would point someone to is just off the press, I think last month, is Beauty and Imitation by, let's get the first name in there, get my finger out of the way, Daniel McInerney. And it's no big thing for me to recommend it, but Peter Crace says it's the best book he's ever read on aesthetics. So that's quite a
high praise.
High praise. And I've read just the introduction and a few other sections, so I'm still working through it myself. But if you want a good classical Aristotelian Thomistic statement about beauty, it's a good place to go.
Marvelous. Well, Dr. Young, thank you so much for joining me today here on the Optimistic Curmudgeon. I've really enjoyed our conversation. It's always great to get together. Any last words you'd like to say?
Well, I think just create in yourself a heart and mind and desire to look for the beautiful, because in doing so, you're opening yourself up to the very presence of God, because there is that passage in the Psalms that we want to be before God, to take pleasure and delight in his beauty for eternity. And I think that's what may well occur, is that we're going to discover the depths of beauty on unendingly, never fatigued with it, being in the presence of God.
Oh, wonderful closing words. So thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been really fun.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure. Good to be with you.
And thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining me today here on The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest has been Dr. Mike Young. The book is Roger Scruton's Beauty, a very short introduction. Until next time, love the good, seek the true, and enjoy the beautiful. You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit the subscribe button and share it with your friends. If you want to let me know what you thought about the episode, or if you want to sponsor an episode, you can always message me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Just search for The Optimistic Curmudgeon. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Until next time, seek the good, pursue the true, and love the beautiful.